people can kind of come in and there we go. We are officially on the air. Pretty exciting.
Exactly.
And that's tweeted, done all the necessary publicity. At least one person watching. We have one viewer. That's pretty exciting. We haven't even done anything yet. This is easy. If I can share this on my own timeline. That's great. Okay. No, now we have 2 viewers. Can't see who the other viewer is. Now I'm getting nervous. 3. Oh my gosh.
Call Nilsson.
That's right. All right, 4 viewers. It's beginning to feel real.
Nice.
Hey, can everyone hear us okay? Are people out in Facebook land hearing the mic and everything? Hearing the feed? Drop us a comment in the comments thing if you can't hear us. Or if you can hear us. Either way. Alright. We have one person liking the comment. I think good. He says good. Alright, we're good to go. So it's this is my first Facebook Live event. It's pretty it's a little disconcerting that we are now live beaming on social media, but it's pretty exciting too. I'm here with Professor Eric Burin from the Department of History, and we're gonna have a conversation about. Look, we have a prop. We're gonna try to get this all filled with Picking the President books, but we thought maybe that wouldn't send the exact right message. But we're here to discuss his book, his edited volume. He's a contributor to the volume. As I said, he's the professor of history here at the University of North Dakota, and he's author of Slavery and the Peculiar Solution, A History of the American Colonization Society, which came out over a decade ago. What have you been doing? No, but this is his newest book, and it's sort of a timely volume, right? I mean, I'm the publisher of the digital press. Dr. Burin sort of put the ear bug in my ear about this idea, really just 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And in 5 weeks, we managed to kind of put together this book of essays on the Electoral College. So what was the thought behind it? I mean, what was the plan?
Right.
Well, I was asked to hold it.
Product placement. Yeah, so in the aftermath of the 2016 election, so many people weighed in on the Electoral College. You had letters to the editor, blogs, videos, all these things. And this is an area of expertise for me, at least the early American Republic. And I thought this would be a way for the academy, university faculty to reach out and shape and inform a debate that a lot of people are weighing in on. I thought it was important. I was really happy that so many had something to say about the Electoral College. So you and I bounced some ideas off each other, and basically what we did is ask scholars in different disciplines to weigh in on the Electoral College on a subject of their choice. These are short, engaging articles written from a variety of disciplinary perspectives: political science, history, philosophy, mathematics. And we put the whole thing together, including an introduction, preface, and historical documents in 5 weeks. And it's free to download at thedigitalpress.org.
Wow, you got the product plug in. Sweet. Yeah, it's always odd to plug something that's free. Yeah, I wonder if I sort of suspect that I've been involved in lots of edited volumes, and usually you're like pulling teeth that someone is submitting someone occasionally me is submitting things 3 years late, and the thing you feel like that they're whatever enthusiasm you have for editing a volume is always sort of dampened by everyone else's lack of enthusiasm for collaborating. And I thought it was cool that people jumped on board so quickly, and they produced in like 10 days, which I think speaks to the sort of timeliness and the sort of maybe even a sense of urgency in the aftermath of the election for people to kind of understand and speak to the complexities of the Electoral College. And I thought one of the most interesting things, and maybe this is just because I'm biased as a historian, was the sort of people's interest in sort of situating the Electoral College within a particular historical context. And I wonder if you could, as we're getting our viewers going, introducing them to the volume, if you could give us a sense for the sort of origins of the Electoral College within the sort of larger American experiment, or whatever, the 18th and 19th century.
Yeah, what's especially interesting is that in 1787, when the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, Americans probably had more experience writing constitutions than any people ever. And it's remarkable to think about what that must have been like. Everyone, today was probably born into the system. You might like the system, you might dislike it, but you pretty much inherited it. And you might be able to change in some ways, but to start from a clean slate is a remarkable thing for any society. And that's what the Americans had, during that Revolutionary era. So when they met in Philadelphia in 1787, they had written the Articles of Confederation, which had misfired in some ways. They had written 13 state constitutions. So they had their own experience, but a lot of the delegates were very well versed in Enlightenment theory and ancient Rome and ancient, Greece, your areas of expertise. So they were drawing on their own experiences as well as the theories of the day. And, not surprisingly, they disagreed on a lot of the subjects that came up. We take it for granted that there was going to be a single person heading the executive branch, but that was a subject of debate at the Constitutional Convention. There were those who said that would be entrusting too much power to a single individual. We should have a sort of executive committee, if you will. So even the notion that we'd have a president as opposed to a council was not a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? The Roman Republic, which was one of the sort of big picture models, had two executives, had two consuls that served 1 year, and they usually had slightly different jurisdictions, but they ultimately had the same big picture responsibilities. So in the immediate aftermath of this kind of constitutional this kind of moment of constitution writing, what do you did the Electoral College in effect serve its function immediately? Did people immediately apprehend the kind of value and the sort of wisdom of this, or was there ongoing conversation over the course of the 19th century? I remember the professor who taught me Civil War history sort of used to say that the Civil War was really where all of the kinks finally got worked out in the sort of the great American the 19th century experiment. So is the Electoral College part of that process?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one could argue that the kinks are still being worked out. It's an ongoing project. No, I think there's a couple of different things to keep in mind when discussing the Electoral College. One is that at the Constitutional Convention, there were three groups that most likely could pick the president: Congress, the states, or the voters. And we could talk about the various ways in which all those were rejected in some way or another. And they ultimately devised the Electoral College. To try to give a very brief summary of the original version of the Electoral College, more or less, states were allotted electors based on the number of people they had in the House of Representatives, plus their 2 senators. The states themselves could choose however they wanted to pick their electors. That was entirely up to the states. Each elector could cast 2 votes for president. And then if no presidential candidate received a majority of electoral votes, then the election would be thrown into the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote. So what they were thinking at the time, this is before political parties had really arisen, and so what they thought was most presidential candidates would be noble, virtuous, broad-minded, well-informed men that were well known within their state or perhaps their region, but probably not nationally known. And so you'd have a whole bunch of candidates like that. And because there weren't political parties, there would be no mechanism by which a single candidate or two would be able to mobilize voters across the nation. And in all likelihood, what would happen is that there would be, a bunch of these candidates, none of them would get a majority of the votes, and then it would be thrown into the House, which would then pick the president and vice president. The rise of political parties in the 1790s changed all of that. And so ultimately the first kink to be resolved was the 12th Amendment, where they more or less acknowledged that political parties would play a role in mobilizing voters nationwide, so you wouldn't have what happened in 1796, which was a member of one party, John Adams, a Federalist, being president, and a member of another party, Thomas Jefferson, a Jeffersonian Republican, serving as vice president.
Right. So do you think, to go kind of off script, do you think that do you see in the 18th and 19th century the rise of sort of national media, and this sort of transformed these kind of colonies that were still in many ways very local political environments into having to participate as states in this larger national media environment?
Right.
And so the at least initial impulse behind the Electoral College, which was this way to vet people who orbited in very small worlds, of their, Dover, Delaware, or wherever, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or wherever it was, to suddenly being national figures that everyone knew these people. I mean, so was the initial early challenges to the Electoral College really something that's brought about? I mean, I guess I'm thinking in contemporary times, we think a lot about the media, right? The media does all, mainstream media, you people out there, do all this stuff. Were some of the issues a media issue?
Yeah, I mean, again, trying to create national parties, you had to have effective means of communication, particularly at a time when the fastest mean of communication was a horse. But through distributing broadsides and pamphlets and basically organizing 18th or 19th century versions of talking points, you could make that happen. I was thinking just the other day, during this era, media outlets, for lack of a better term, were entirely partisan. But I'm old enough to remember a time period when at least the major national networks were at least largely regarded as nonpartisan. And now we've almost gone back to an 18th century or early 19th century style where really the media outlets are basically blatantly partisan in one way or another. There's still some exceptions to that. So in a weird sort of way, we're reverting back to that earlier era in terms of mobilizing people through partisan means.
Right. So emerging then in something that ironically is Back to the Future kind of thing, like going back to this sort of different conception of the media in the early 21st century that may echo. Where does this leave the sort of Electoral College within this? Is it possible today, for example, to have we were talking in the hallway just 20 minutes ago, was it possible to have a conversation about the Electoral College that isn't ultimately partisan? I mean, can we step back? And should we? I mean, is because the American Republic, for as long as it's lived, more or less, except for this tiny window in the late 18th century, been a partisan entity.
Right. I
mean, can we and should we?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I wanted to do with this volume, in conjunction with your efforts, is to try to strip away the partisanship, to encourage people to evaluate the Electoral College on its own merits, and I think when you get into conversations about democracy and republicanism and communications and these sorts of things, or simple mathematics or fairness or justice, then you can have more far-ranging conversations as opposed to whether it advances one party's interest or another. Whether or not that can be translated from this volume or this live feed to the larger audience, I guess is something that remains to be seen.
As soon as we started talking about partisanship, the number of viewers plummeted. So people are out. So I thought one of the interesting things that some of the essays in this book brought up was the fact that historically, even if we say that it's going to be a challenge for us to move beyond a kind of partisan conversation, or even that's kind of baked into the way the Republic had been conceptualized, or at least actualized, for over 200 years, the idea of the Electoral College hasn't always been a sort of Republican or Democratic idea.
No.
That various parties have supported it at various times,
right.
and they haven't always had the most prospective views. They haven't always said, okay, we won it this time, but looking down the road,
right.
now that we have power, we have the opportunity to change something that will provide us with opportunities
right.
down the road. So can you talk a little bit about the sort of 20th and 21st century life of the Electoral College and the way in which it intersects with partisan politics?
Yeah, not surprisingly, oftentimes people think about the Electoral College in terms of whether it advances one party's interests or another, but there have been occasions where there's been considerable bipartisan support for reforming or abolishing the Electoral College. The 1960s were a case in point. Johnson wanted reform, Nixon wanted reform, Gerald Ford wanted reform, and again, they were responding to the events of their day, but then that gets into questions of like, okay, if you had bipartisan support in the 60s for reform or outright abolition of the Electoral College, why didn't it come to why didn't it come to fruition? And then you get into questions of how the Senate operates and the interests of small states, but also something that I think is largely overlooked, and that's the question of states get allotted a certain number of electoral votes no matter how many people actually vote in the state. One of the shortcomings, I think, of the Electoral College is that it doesn't sort of dissuade or deter states from disfranchising their own citizens. So back in 1969, when you had this buy-seller amendment, which was gaining momentum and looked like you'd actually have reform on the Electoral College, it was killed effectively by southern states who didn't want to give up a system that allowed them to disfranchise African Americans, but still get to claim African Americans' representation when it came to allotting electoral votes. So again, we can talk about republicanism, democracy, and partisanship, but also it has to do with the internal dynamics of a state itself.
Yeah, so we're coming. This obviously is always a kind of backyard issue in some ways, right? I mean, that here sitting in the glorious 50-degree day in the state of North Dakota, we're thinking that my vote is worth a good bit. I mean, I had the good fortune of growing up in Delaware and then moving out here, to stops along the way to North Dakota. I've been in two states where we have less than a million citizens. I don't know how many voters North Dakota has, but I imagine 300,000 or 200,000.
400,000 maybe.
Yeah, something along those lines. Like my vote for the president's worth a ton. And also the state has, as if not unique concerns characteristic of a particular kind of settlement in the U.S. Right, like low density, agricultural, aging population. We could even say a sort of affinity for traditional values or whatever we want to. Would changes in the Electoral College changes to the Electoral College or doing away with it affect the value of our vote out here? Would it marginalize us potentially?
Right. Many of the essays address in picking the president address that very issue. And so, one of the essays, Ben Casso talks about, well, if you replace it with something, you should think about what you're going to be replacing with. What are the trade-offs? Another essay by historian Andrew Meyer who studies Chinese history talks a lot about China being very similar in that regard, and that basically there are parts of China that were prosperous and densely populated, and there are other parts of China that had lower GDPs, and basically, to keep it all together, you had to have some sort of, for lack of a better expression, affirmative action. for the northern portions of China,
Right.
in much the same way that, in effect, the Electoral College allows Wyoming and North Dakota and similar states extra political power. And of course, the detractors say that's undemocratic, that's inegalitarian, and if you get rid of that, that sort of tilts it back towards a small d democratic process. But again, as some of our essays suggest, that also would entail certain kinds of costs. Although I will say, Jack Russell Weinstein also pointed out that it's somewhat unfair to assume that all rural areas are going to be alike, and that all urban areas are going to be alike. Rural folk disagree on all kinds of things, and so to assume that all rural folk are going to agree on ag policy or subsidies or these kinds of things might be a misconception.
So a couple of the essays specifically address what went down in the most recent election. I thought Tim Prescott's, for example, was pretty interesting. So can we take away anything from this election in particular that informs how we think about the Electoral College in the future? In other words, is this just another blip? In other words, in the kind of long history of the Electoral College, and I think Jack Weinstein's paper sort of framed this, quite to the forefront. Well, if it works most of the time, is that good enough? And of course he says no. If it doesn't work all the time, then it's intrinsically broken. I mean, that's his argument, right? Whether one likes it or not. So what can we come away, is there anything, on the one hand, can you explain a little bit what went down in this election in terms of popular and electoral votes? And can we use this as a way to understand how the Electoral College is likely to function in the future, and whether this is a system that we should recognize as problematic, or should we say, this is a hiccup, or should we say it did exactly what it was supposed to do? It served its purpose.
Right.
In the framers' minds or whoever's minds, right?
So, in part, you have to go back to, again, the 1790s, and they had this original conception of the Electoral College that was going to pick among noble-minded men, but then there's this rise of political parties, and that caused the Electoral College to misfire. And then they passed the 12th Amendment in 1804. And what the 12th Amendment does is, instead of the electors casting 2 ballots for president, it clearly identifies you cast 1 ballot for president, 1 ballot for vice president. In effect, this acknowledged that we weren't picking amongst a whole bunch of noble-minded but regional figures, but rather we're going to identify political platforms, and a single candidate will head them. In effect, it's acknowledged that these are going to be small d democratic ventures. So the problem with the 12th Amendment was that it kind of left us with a schizophrenic process where it has some of the elements of the old system where we're envisioning picking among virtuous, disinterested presidential candidates, and a system that acknowledges that it's going to be just a small d democratic process. So really, you're gathering as many votes as you can, but you also kind of have to just hope that those votes are distributed to the right place, in the right states. And that's why you occasionally have these episodes where, like, Hillary Clinton won nearly 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but, whether by chance or coincidence or some other mechanism, they didn't happen to be distributed in the right places, and thus the Electoral College awards the presidential campaign or the election to Donald Trump. So in some ways, to get at that question, you have to go back to the 12th Amendment. Again, we don't operate under the original Electoral College. We operate under a modified Electoral College, which, again, according to one of our essayists, Andrew Shankman, left us with a sort of schizophrenic system that doesn't really serve either well. It's not a popular vote, and it's not the sort of noble-minded, virtuous system that the founders originally envisioned.
So we actually have a question that's sort of related to this a little bit, or it's related to this stream of conversation. So after the last election, some support for the Electoral College via individuals citing the need for voters in rural communities not to be overshadowed by those more densely populated ones. Obviously, this argument has problems, but it's prevalent. So how have politicians over time and scholars today sort of address that particular argument? I mean, you've mentioned that this idea that rural areas are homogeneous. I mean, I'm sort of compelled by the view that actually most of the U.S. is kind of purplish. That that it's, and I think there's been some compelling recent sociological studies of talking to conservatives and talking to liberals and saying really when you scratch below the surface these they actually aren't that different. They all have certain similar values, and then at times how they see these politically manifest are rather divergent. Right. So anyway, how have scholars thought about this? Is scholarship on the Electoral College sort of addressed and acknowledged these ideas of different ways through time?
So I just want to make sure I understand your question. Is it the idea that why, in effect, do some people get additional political power based solely on where they happen to live? Is that?
Yeah, but also how is the discourse of the Electoral College, say within scholarship, identified and sort of considered its problems through time? Has it been a sort of always framed as this kind of fundamental constitutionalist issue? Like how do we understand what the framers were trying to do, or the 12th Amendmenters were trying to do? Or has this been viewed differently through time as, say, the issues involving, say, the franchise in southern states in efforts to remove voting rights from African Americans after with Jim Crow and things like that? Have people considered the Electoral College in those contexts and changed the way in which people have talked about it? In other words, has it been ever like I thought some of the things that you've said recently have been very interesting, that there's a sort of racial component to what the electoral, if states disenfranchise large numbers of voters through any sort of, whether it's fear tactics or through legislative means, that has an impact on the way the Electoral College functions in some ways, even if it's not explicitly,
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting elements to the argument for a popular vote is that it would flip the script in terms of incentivizing voting. So right now, states pay no price for disfranchising their own citizens, whether it's through voter ID or limiting early voting or closing polling stations or something like that. They'd still get the same number of electoral votes no matter what happens, and no matter how many people are turned away. Whereas if you had a popular vote, then states suddenly have an incentive to get out the vote. And if your state is really on the ball and tries to get people out, to the polls as best as possible, then you can even have more political clout than a larger state. And I suppose, that would be helpful to a state like North Dakota if we really, pushed out the vote. You could make the argument, well, what happens if more populous states suddenly start cranking out the vote too? And then I guess in that case, the price we would pay for, reforming or ultimately ditching the Electoral College would be a robust democracy where you have really high voter turnouts.
Right. Well, yeah, North Dakota is always interesting to me because there's no voter registration, right? And this was, at least my understanding of North Dakota history, this was put in place because it was, not densely, it was sparsely settled. People would live, in some cases, quite far from their voting places that didn't have, which may seem ironic to people familiar with North Dakota today, it didn't have robust government infrastructures to manage things like voter registration over vast areas. So you just didn't have it because it wasn't necessary, which means that it's very easy to vote in North Dakota, which means when there's hand-wringing about voter fraud, that's part of that conversation. But on the other hand, if we move to a popular vote, or if you could imagine that, we could be a place that has almost no obstacles to large-scale voter turnout, right?
Right. And again, what people will sometimes say against the popular vote is that, well, then you're just going to have a whole bunch of factional candidates. If you have enough candidates, then somebody might win the presidency with 15% of the vote because there's 20 viable presidents. And back in the 1960s, when there was serious conversation about reforming or getting rid of the Electoral College, they dealt with these issues, right? So I think it was Nixon's proposal who said, like, you have to have at least 40% of the popular vote. And if you don't, then you have an automatic runoff. Or you could have a sort of automatic runoffs where you would have, you vote for the candidate that you want, but then you could also vote, if my candidate doesn't get a certain number of votes, here's my second candidate that I want. And so you could get into those kinds of issues. I mean, the unfortunate thing about the partisanship is that there's great, political scientists and geographers who are doing really interesting work on how to make elections more equitable and attractive, frankly. And yet we're discarding all these really interesting ideas, in part because political parties control the process. Right? So I think it's California that just allowed, maybe a few years ago, to put districting in the hands of a nonpartisan commission. And I think that's more common in other nations as well, but in North Dakota at least, the way they draw the boundary lines is controlled by whatever party controls the legislature. It's the old saying that in this case, politicians are picking their voters as opposed to the voters picking their politicians. And so if we just break that up, then we might have more interesting elections and people might be more engaged. And again, you could do things with ranked voting and those kinds of things. And so you could have a more robust civic engagement. And I think everyone wins in that case.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions we just got said is it valid to assert that the average citizen, in quotes, has no real concept of how the Electoral College works? Thus eliminating it would actually make for more informed voters, ironically.
Right. That's interesting. I don't know the numbers on or if there are numbers on polling about, tell me how the Electoral College actually operates. I'd imagine if you ask people some really specific picayune questions, they probably would struggle on some of the more minute details.
In fact, when we were getting the book together, I asked what I thought was a question that people could just bang out the answer to, but how do various states actually select their electors?
Right.
And I think it involved at least 3 or 4 people Googling a lot to figure this out. Every state has different, does an elector even have to be a citizen of the state? Could North Dakota pick as its elector, the mayor of Kansas City? Why not? Or whatever.
Right, exactly.
And every state's different.
Right. And that was, again, during the early years of the Republic, that was a big point of debate. The Constitution lets the states, choose the method by which they're going to select their electors. Early on, that power was entrusted with the state legislature. And then others sort of did it by what was called the district method, where individual districts would choose their electors. What was interesting was that it became fairly clear in the 1790s and early 1800s that states that adopted a winner-take-all system had an advantage over states that didn't. So back in 1796, Jefferson lost the electoral vote by three votes, and that could be attributed to the fact that in 3 states he dominated, except for in 1 or 2 little areas, and so he lost 3 electoral votes in states that he otherwise dominated. And there were 3 stray Federalist electors who went for Adams, thereby giving Adams the electoral vote. If those states had adopted the winner-take-all system, Jefferson probably would have won that 1796 election. What's interesting now, and by the way, Madison later said, when we envisioned this, we didn't envision a winner-take-all system. We envisioned a district method. He says this, in 1823, a document included in our book, in a letter. Right now, there's some people talking about going back to the district system or embracing a district system, but as is often the case, partisanship is driving that conversation. I think the idea in this case would be, because districts are so gerrymandered, that even if you lost the popular vote in a state, you would still pick up a lot of electoral votes, probably almost guaranteed, given the level of gerrymandering. So partisanship is driving this renewed interest in the district system as opposed to the winner-take-all system.
So just to clarify in my own head, there's two, even now, there are two different ways in which electoral votes are apportioned, right? You have winners take all, which is what, all states but two?
48 of the states, yeah.
Yeah, so how does Maine and Nebraska, is that the two?
It's Nebraska and Maine. That sounds right. So yeah, what they do is the winner of the popular vote in the state gets 2 electoral votes. In effect, the Senate, their senatorial allotment, and then they divide the state into districts, and whoever wins that district is awarded that district's electoral vote. So you can see, whereas every other state, it's winner take all. Doesn't matter, who wins what district. In Nebraska and Maine, sometimes you'll see it go, 3 votes for one person because they won the overall vote and, a plurality or majority in one district, but didn't win the majority or plurality in the other district, and therefore, Maine and Nebraska might go 3-1 instead of 4-0.
And how are the districts set up?
I assume those are their congressional districts.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah. So they would presumably be vulnerable to the kind of gerrymandering that people are recently been concerned about, but maybe in these states it's not as pressing an issue, or everyone agrees or something.
Right.
So the other thing that's come up in the comments is this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. How does this is a sort of alternative, and in some people's mind, a way to sort of circumvent the complications, the constitutional complications of actually dealing with the 12th Amendment from a formal constitutional way. So how did they imagine this to work?
Right. So the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is basically a way of instituting a popular vote without having to go to amend the Constitution. For those who want reform, there's probably been, I wouldn't say no worse time to try to reform the Constitution in this regard, because not only have Republicans won the presidency, but they've also won both houses of Congress and 33, I think, governorships and 68 of 99 legislative houses. So for those who want to get rid of the Electoral College, and if they don't have Republican support for it, it's not going to happen. So one way to basically get a popular vote without amending the Constitution is through this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, in which states would agree, or are agreeing, to give their electoral votes to whichever candidate wins the national popular vote, regardless of what happens in their particular state. And this would go into effect once a requisite number of states signed on to this compact, the requisite number being they account for 270 electoral votes, enough to actually elect somebody president. So 10 states plus the District of Columbia have all signed on. The problem for those in favor of this mechanism is that the states that have signed on thus far have leaned pretty Democratic. So they're 61% of the way there. They've gotten enough electoral votes to account for 61% of the votes that they need, but the remaining 39% are in swing states, which are probably not willing to give up their outsized influence in the Electoral College, or states that are controlled by Republicans, who at this juncture aren't particularly keen. Right. But that's the funny thing, right? For those who are actually hopeful of reform, when we look back at the long history of the Electoral College, the episodes in which there was the greatest chance for reform occurred when the Electoral College produced controversial results, and when there were party realignments or party tumult. And you could make the argument that those are characteristics that we're seeing in our political climate today. Right. So even though it looks rather bleak in some respects, You never know. As late as 6 months ago, 54% of Republicans wanted reform in the Electoral College. That number plummeted to 19% after the election. But there have been times when Republicans were very much in favor of this. And so this is one of those instances where party realignments, controversial results, different political headwinds could really change the dynamics of these conversations.
So one of the commenters, maybe it's from Brad Austin, so a little tongue-in-cheek, but he says, he asked, which was the best essay on teaching the Electoral College. He contributed an essay on that particular topic. But all kidding aside, like how do you go about teaching? I have the luxury of not having to deal with the Electoral College. Western Civ 1. We don't talk about the Electoral College very much. But one of the things that was interesting is in the immediate aftermath of the election, there was quite a conversation among historians about how do you teach this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like how do you teach what happened? How do you teach everything ranging from President Trump's kind of unusual form of way of engaging the media, all the way to sort of more technical things about the Electoral College and popular votes. How do you teach the Electoral College, or what's an approach that this election allows you? Is there anything this election allowed you to kind of deal with in a classroom that had a sense of urgency that maybe nothing is worth? Obama's wins were at least a second win was fairly convincing, a fairly routine election, it seems to me.
Right. How do you
teach
it? Yeah, I mean, this is one of the, historians try to teach more than just names and dates, right? It's about, the skill sets of research and analysis and communication, but it also concerns developing a sense of empathy, like the sense of trying to look at the world through another person's eyes, or a sense of trying to understand a world in which you don't inhabit. And Austin's essay in the book, deals with that issue quite well. And so again, one of the reasons we included historical documents in the book, is to allow students and their instructors to go through and say, like, why would Madison say this? What was his worldview such that he was, worried about this phenomenon or that phenomenon? Or, why would somebody be opposed to the United States Constitution altogether? What was going on in the world at the time that would make them fearful of, foreign intrigue or large, strong national governments? Or what would make them want that? And so, again, to encourage this sense of empathy, to encourage this sense of seeing the world through another person's eyes, the Electoral College is actually a pretty useful tool for doing that. I mean, I suppose one of the things you could do is simply set up an Electoral College-like system within your own class and accord to some students extra political power and accord to others less power and make them feel as other people might feel. And maybe they would get a sense of whether their arguments are based on one thing or another.
So, I know historians hate thinking this way, but it's sort of, I think a lot of the essays in the book had this kind of, looking to the future feeling about them, right? That sometimes historians feel, at least speaking for myself, a lot more comfortable when you're writing about something that only 17 people care about. Like I can, working on stuff.
How
right
many
now.
viewers do we have?
We have more than 17.
All right.
So, but the big question is, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, do you think that is the Electoral College and decisions regarding it fundamentally random at this point? That whatever one says about Trump's presidency, his way of winning was, sufficiently unusual that most of the pundits got it wrong. And as long as we live in a world where we can't anticipate even the pundits who are paid to anticipate who gets elected president, no one's going to mess with anything because, man, it's like in a NASCAR race when you change too many variables and you don't even know what you got right. So is there looking ahead, or can we see long-term demographic trends? Can we see the sort of big picture that says, the Electoral College has had a good run, but maybe we'll see it for 2-3 more elections. But by the time we're sitting on our front porch complaining about the past, it's going to be a thing. Our kids not going to have electoral colleges to even learn about.
That's above my pay grade. No, that's a great question. And again, I think addressing the structural issues to change are so elemental. And again, who knows how the demographics will play out over time. But again, just looking at who controls the levels of political power right now and their current political attitudes towards the Electoral College makes change seem unlikely. But as Mark Jędrysik says in his essay, given the demographics of what's going on, and if this continues to be a virtually random phenomenon of like how we pick the most powerful person in the world, you're eventually going to get a crisis of legitimacy. I mean, in the 21st century, 40% of our presidential elections have not gone to the winner of the popular vote. And if this becomes a regular feature of the Electoral College and it basically bites both political parties, or it becomes so skewed that there develops this crisis of legitimacy, then we either are headed to a major constitutional crisis, or you'll have some inflection point and there might actually be reform.
So we got two now. Of course, we're coming to the end of our time. Virtually, all the questions start coming in. So another question is: since national polling does not account for the Electoral College, how would a possible change to popular vote affect polling and the election season in general?
Boy, that's an excellent question. So I think the idea is that, if I understand the question correctly, really we have 51 elections. We have 50 for the state and then the District of Columbia, and you can only do so much polling in each of those states, and then outfits like 538, there's your plug, get to aggregate these, and then they also take national polls. So one would think that polling might be a little bit better if all they had to worry about was national polling, but maybe not. Maybe if you had basically 50 separate state polls, and then you aggregate those in a particularly clever way, and then you lay on top of that national polling, perhaps that would produce more accurate results. But I could see the opposite argument as well, that you'd be better off not worrying about the quality of all these individual little polls, and you could just do national polling, and that'd be simple enough.
Do you think it would affect the relationship between, we heard a lot about coattails, right? Do you think a national election would, a national popular vote would, you've kind of nibbled around this a little bit, would sever the relationship between state politics and national politics? In other words, could you imagine, without the Electoral College, the state and national parties essentially being separate entities to a very real extent, because ultimately your constituency is so fundamentally different at that point, right? That you could conceivably have either more third parties, or you could have just national parties that aren't the same as we see it in name here, right? The Democrat NPL, right? It's not the federal NPL party. I don't think there's ever a federal NPL party. Could you see that split sort of emerging?
Yeah, well, especially, my first instinct is to say, especially they would put their resources where they thought they were most valuable, but they do that already, right? One of the arguments that people make about the Electoral College in favor is that it demands regionalism, but I'm not totally convinced about that. Like, the presidential candidates and their campaigns go to wherever the swing votes, or wherever the battleground states are. So it doesn't really force regionalism. If all the battleground states happen to be in the South, that's where they would go. If all of them happen to be in New England, that's where they would go.
Yeah, and Trump played this. Those who argue that his strategy was, particularly scientific. He played this to the key, right? He targeted states where he felt like he could get an edge, and other states just not. Makes sense to some extent, right?
One again, speaking of this national popular vote thing, one argument that I find interesting is that if in an oddly good scenario, I think, if states were trying to crank out the vote, a counter argument would be like, well, then you would have increase in voter fraud, right? Because there'd be this incentive to get out the vote. And I think, state representatives and county auditors are conscientious enough to do the right thing. But actually, the likelihood of fraud determining the outcome of the presidential contest would diminish. Right? Because in 2000, 500 votes, some odd votes, determined the outcome in Florida, whereas 500 votes in a national election would be immaterial. I mean, even if you had the absurd scenario of 1,000 cases of voter fraud in every single state, which again is ridiculous given the actual levels of voter fraud, that'd only be 50,000 votes when contests are usually decided by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of votes.
Yeah.
So the likelihood of voter fraud determining the outcome of the election would be less in a national popular vote than in the Electoral College.
So along similar lines, and even pushing your willingness to speculate further, a commenter said, coming to an inflection point, is there a way that U.S. we could imagine them moving to a parliamentary system, in effect, a proportional system of government? Is this, if the Electoral College is so deeply baked into the kind of the sort of partisan political system, would eliminating that open up the possibility that you have 17 people, 15 people running for president, even 4 or 5. I mean, I'm thinking back to the late 60s efforts to reform the Electoral College. How much of those were in response to George Wallace's relative success running?
Exactly.
Which would have been a sort of move. So I'm not sure eliminating the Electoral College would make us more likely to be parliamentary. To have not that multiple candidates for president necessarily are parliamentary.
Right.
But that's a sort of move in that direction, because it would force coalition governments to exist more frequently. It would. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that?
Yeah. Again, as a historian, I tend to be far more comfortable backward, looking backwards. I suppose, again, to look back at the 1960s episode, one of the things that inspired this sort of bipartisan support was a strong third-party challenge by George Wallace. And so there was concerns that, a few votes in this state or a few votes in that state would have thrown the election into the House. And then who knows, what could happen, especially since in the House, each state gets one vote.
Right.
So
we think the Electoral College is bad. That would be,
Exactly. Yeah. So I suppose that would be a possibility, but again, as somebody's more comfortable looking to the past than speculating on the future, maybe that'll be the next book.
Yeah. So okay, one last thing, and then we'll probably we'll relieve you from your celebrity. A couple of people have asked about the project itself, and about just how we think this type of publishing venture could have an impact on the way in which scholarship is produced, and particularly on these salient topics like these popular topics, these topics that have a shelf life like the Electoral College. What did you think? I mean, do you think that what do we gain, what do we lose from doing it this way?
I actually think this illustrates some of the best aspects of the humanities and digital technologies and responsiveness and those kinds of things. This is a time period when public education is under tremendous strain, and institutions of higher learning are reorganizing and prioritizing, and people could say, what can the humanities offer? And I think, again, the impetus for the book was the fact that so many people were writing op-eds and blogs and videos on the Electoral College. So there is this demand for public engagement, and this is something where historians and political scientists and communications folks and even mathematicians can offer something, and we can do so in an expeditious fashion, right? No offense to my friends in the drone business, but we put the book out in 5 weeks. From conception to completion. I assume it takes longer than that to build a drone. So, again, I think this is a way in which higher education can, in gooden, as you might say, expand and facilitate, issues of tremendous importance in the public sphere.
I thought one thing that was particularly useful about this project is it got me to think about what I think about. Maybe a third, maybe half of these essays were written for other venues, right?
Right.
And you found them, and I think I knew one or two of them, but I didn't realize the sort of. I mean, we're living in an area of distributed media even more now, right? We've made not just every political party, but every discipline, every every sub discipline, every interest group. I don't read HNet. What couple of these were published on HNet. Whatever 19th century America or whatever. Yeah, and these are places I don't usually hang out. And I thought it was really interesting to be able to bring them together into a single volume to sort of cut through a little bit. 3 or 4 years ago, everyone was talking about curating, right? Everything is curated. I have a curated collection of socks. I have a curated whiskey bar or whatever. That we were effectively able to curate this group of contributions, and that people seemed really willing to not only give us their stuff. And have it reach a different audience, but there were also relatively few barriers to us doing that. Even the piece that was published on the Washington Post website, I think it had a copyright that expired in 7 days or something. For that, it was an op-ed. So we could do that, and I thought the inclusion of documents also went along that. I mean, we had to fish a little bit, but generally speaking, people were willing to allow us to get documents that had either copyright or much more frequently that were coming from special archives and then compile them together and package them up in a way that could be distributed easily. So our authority went from being producers of new forms of knowledge to also curating these new forms of knowledge. And I thought there's a segue there with what we do in the classroom. There's a segue in how we approach the university. In fact, thinking about I don't have to know everything about the Civil War era or the whatever France, but I have to have enough knowledge to be able to bring together. My expertise allows me to bring together people who speak to these other issues. And I thought, oh yeah, this is a great example of how the way we think in universities can actually has greater relevance in an era of increasingly distributed media, because so often what we're called upon to do as professors is not, and as teachers and as scholars, is not so much, go into the archives and beat our way through, a box of documents or sit in the sort of, dusty artifact storerooms, but pull together and say, this is good, this is good, this is good. We can assemble this in a way that allows our students, our colleagues, our constituents, our stakeholders, right? Everyone's a stakeholder, to think differently, or to approach a topic critically, or see a range of attitudes.
Right. Yeah, and again, even the way we organize the volume. So, the first section concerns the Electoral College in comparative perspective, and we have historians of Chinese history and ancient history and medieval history, and then we have a section on the Electoral College in historical perspective and basically how it's operated over time, and then we have a section where scholars just weigh in one way or another. It should be reformed, it should not be reformed, and then we have that fourth section on pedagogy. And so it's neat that we're able to put together things that already existed out there, reach out to people that we thought could add something new to the mix, again, include these historical documents at the same time, and distribute them all for free. I was quite gratified when a high school history teacher here in Grand Forks reached out to me just the other day and said, I'm using that book. It's great for my civics class or my history class or my government class. And again, at the price was right, because they can just download it for free or buy it on Amazon.com for a modest sum.
Right. I think it's neat when I go back and look at the metrics, and you see a bunch of things coming from firewalled content. Management services mean they're coming from systems. They're coming from Blackboard, or they're coming from various different systems that universities have set up. So basically, it's links coming out of classes. That's how you can kind of say, oh, this isn't just being thrown up on a faculty member's blog or whatever, but this is actually coming from a classroom setting. And so it's really cool to be able to see that. So go download the book for free. It's fantastic. If you really, really like the smell of freshly printed paper. It's on Amazon. You can just search for Picking the President. It's $8. All proceeds go directly back to the university. Think of it as like paying taxes or something. And I want to thank Eric for putting up with my kind of crazy questions and wanting to sit around and do this Facebook Live thing. Thanks to people stopping by and watching us and showing interest in what we're up to.
Yes, thank you. Thank everyone out there. Thank the North Dakota Humanities Council. Thank Digital Press of University of North Dakota, and all the contributors and again, folks who tuned in today and asked questions and showed their support in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, maybe we'll do this again sometime soon.